In order to do history of science of any given culture, one has to take a multidisciplinary approach. But besides that, being a historian doing history of science requires taking a social angle.
Ma'am, what are the social determinants conditioning or guiding the dissemination of scientific knowledge?
It is specific to each culture. Now, in case of ancient India, which is taking together early historical period and early medieval period, we would say that the first factor would be material culture, then the social goals of the society, then the institutions of dissemination of knowledge of which science formed a part, and then the modes of dissemination of knowledge in which language, the medium of dissemination, forms a very important crucial factor. Then a very important thing so far as ancient India is concerned was the distinct categorization of specific branches of knowledge. As placing them into the formal acknowledged scope of knowledge system, and some that were left as not so important or even lesser forms of knowledge. Now, so far as science is concerned, science is such a discipline which cannot be really worked out, it cannot be completely conditioned within classrooms or even within institutions of knowledge. Achievements of science were taking place every day in the workroom of the artisans, for example. So, that was what was a very important factor so far as designing the knowledge dissemination pattern is concerned, because if the society decides that these are the formal knowledge system and these are the knowledge that have to be disseminated to the people, those knowledge may not include the workroom knowledge of the artisan, so that a chunk of what is science is being left out of formal dissemination systems. So these are the main social determining factors. There was also constriction so far as gender is concerned, so far as dissemination of knowledge to the total populace is concerned, and also there was a class factor which also operated. So, taking all these things together, we have to understand the environs in which knowledge as a science culture had developed in the early medieval period.
Ma'am, which are the fields in which early medieval India witnessed advancements in scientific knowledge?
Now, it would be wrong to periodize the evolution of scientific knowledge. It is better that we look at the phase of developments within the science systems themselves. And if we look at that, if we start with that, then we have to start with Aryabhatta, and we find that the disciplines of mathematics and astronomy had made a great leap forward from the post-Maurya times onwards till we come to the end of our period, that is 12th century AD. So we have to start with what Aryabhatta had done. He, for example, was the first person to originate the epicyclic theory of calculations so far as astronomy is concerned. Not only that, he also began calculating the indeterminate equations of the first order. You see, at that time, the foreign knowledge systems had also penetrated into India. Because if you look at the political situation, we have the Sakas, the Kushans having come into India, and also the Indo-Romans much before that. So they had introduced the Greek concepts of astronomy as well as mathematics, which was taken together with the earlier Indian systems of astronomy and mathematics. Now, in Aryabhatiya, he had propounded certain significant concepts of mathematics. In arithmetic, he gave place value. The numbers were mentioned in alphabetical order with their place values. Now, that was a very unique thing which was followed later on by Brahmagupta. We also find that Aryabhatta was probably the first scientist in the whole world who had propounded the theory that the earth rotated on its own axis. This he termed as Bhu-Brahmana-Vada. You see, Aryabhatta propounded this theory of Bhu-Brahmana-Vada, which went against the then popular religious concepts. The people in those days believed that the earth was stationed at the center of the universe and that it was static. Now, from that concept, Aryabhatta's revolutionary idea was absolutely something which could not be accepted. And therefore, Aryabhatta has been criticized severely by later scientists like Varahamihira and Brahmagupta himself. Now, we find that the use of the half-chord measurement system in case of astronomy, that was taken up by Varahamihira and the later practitioners of astronomy. Brahmagupta did not accept that method, but then Brahmagupta carried the concept of place value system, and he was the one who first utilized the concept of zero, gave it a place value and used it to enhance the system of decimal numbering, which we already had since the Rigvedic days, but in the form of words. We have Brahmagupta, as I told you. Then there were few 9th century AD mathematicians who achieved a lot of fame at that time. They in fact composed certain compendiums which became textbooks. Mathematics and astronomy had become regular disciplines taught to the students, both at the elementary and at the higher levels of dissemination. For example, there was Sridhara from Bengal, whose text was extremely popular in this region, in eastern India. Then there was Mahanandin of Benares from 9th century AD, who was also very famous, and Sripati from Maharashtra. Then when we come to the 11th century AD onwards, we have a very particularly important text which also became a very popular text on astronomy, but which is anonymous, unfortunately enough. It is Surya Siddhanta. Now, this Surya Siddhanta actually is a very good compilation of all earlier calculations and concepts on astronomy. And there was a foundation chapter where all the geometrical principles which come into the aid of astronomical calculations were laid down. Now, besides that, we could say that the most eminent scientist of early medieval period was actually Bhaskaracharya II. Do you know that he composed a very big compendium which is Siddhanta Ceremony? It had 4 different books under it. And one of the books, I think you have heard about it, is Lilavati, a book on arithmetics. And then we have the other 3 adhyaya, the Ganita Adhyaya, the Gola Adhyaya, the Bija Ganita Adhyaya. So all these taken together was a very big research work. Bhaskaracharya II probably was again another first person, the one who first expounded a concept that the earth had a gravitational force. Bhaskaracharya II came up with this theory that the earth had the Akrishta Shakti, a particular force which keeps it in its own place, thereby propounding perhaps the first premises for developing the concept of the gravitational force of earth. So these are the things. For example, Aryabhatta had already calculated the circumference of the earth. Because he believed in the rotation of the earth, he also calculated the whole year in terms of days. And he gave almost an exact calculation, that is around 365 days, a little bit more than the normal idea that we have now. So these are the certain significant achievements which laid the foundation, and then we had the early medieval period developments in the fields of mathematics and astronomy. In the Naya Vaisesika system, in the Sankhya system, we have the certain philosophical principles laid down to understand and define what matter was, padartha, dravya. Medicine had taken great leaps and bounds in the early historical period. We have had the Charaka Samhita as well as the Susruta Samhita already composed. So when we come to the early medieval period, we do not really have too many innovations in the fields of medicine as such. But what we have is more and more additional work in the fields of matter, in the field of dravya. Dravya, which was a very important part of pharmaceuticals. They also were an important part of doing metallurgical works. There were innumerable texts composed on this particular discipline, that is Dravya Sangraha, Dravya Prakasha, you name it, you have all the texts on Dravya. Now if you read those texts, you will find that basically the ideas have been collated from the actual practitioners of different crafts, arts and artisanry. For example, we find that if we look at the technological application of science in technology and the outputs of technology, then early medieval period really witnessed a lot of development. We have the development in cosmetology, we have the development in wine distilling, we have developments in alchemy. Now alchemy, when we come to the esoteric parts of alchemy, the magical, mythical parts of alchemy, of course we find that they cannot be accepted within the paradigms of scientific or rational culture. But when we look at how the ingredients that they were talking about, the reactions between the ingredients that they are talking about, although the results that they are coming up with are basically limited within the scope of alchemy, that is transmutation of baser metal into gold or making an elixir which makes men immortal. But the ingredients that are being used and the reactions between the ingredients and the description of the output, that has been taken from the workroom of the metallurgist. That has been taken from the workroom of the pharmacists. So here we find that there was a gradual development in technology, but it was slowly getting dissociated from the actual theoretical disciplines of science, which were given a sanctity as formal knowledge. Now Ayurveda, mathematics, astronomy were being taught as disciplines to the students in early medieval period, whereas the actual day-to-day knowledge which an artisan, a metallurgist had, a blacksmith had, a coppersmith had, or a pharmacist had, that did not get transmitted into the classrooms. In the field of architecture, from the early days, we find that building technology had gone hand in hand with the developments in mathematics, especially in geometry and trigonometry. Now this hand in hand development somehow, somewhere got dissociated. So that when we come down to the early medieval times, we have treatises on architecture per se, like Manasara and Mayamata. Now these texts give us a lot of calculations, lot of dimensions of measurements, but only given in dimension form. If one reads these texts, one finds that there is some gap in knowledge, how it is being projected. Now there could be many reasons for this lacuna in how the knowledge is being packed in either Mayamata or in Manasara. One reason could be Mantragupti, which had become again another social factor which conditioned the dissemination of knowledge, especially scientific knowledge. That is, if a group of workers, because it was hereditary, occupation had become hereditary, therefore there was a great tendency of the knowledge that they had being limited within themselves, within that endogamous caste itself, and not really traveling beyond it. The second reason is that the actual composer of the treatise was not conversant enough either with the mathematical foundations, or that they were the actual sutradharas who were composing the texts, but they were not literary enough to have compiled the total knowledge in a language format. It limited the scope of development. It limited the scope of exchange of knowledge between one branch and another branch of science, or one branch of technology and another branch of science. We also find another factor playing a great role is the more and more the popularization of rituals practiced by the scientists as well as the people who were using technology. So these are certain things which delimited or probably overshadowed the growth of scientific knowledge. Early medieval period is a very important period because it laid the scope, the foundations for what was to happen in the medieval period. And what was to happen in the medieval period was a great exchange of idea and cooking of this scientific information coming from China to India or India to China, or from Arabia to India or India to Arabia. So that throughout the whole continent of Asia, there was this bubbling up of scientific knowledge and also technological achievements. So you see that there was this great world of science which was developing, which had started in the early medieval period and would develop in the medieval period further.
Ma'am, could you please give us an example of a particular technology in which development took place in this early medieval period?
Now you see, we can talk about various fields of technology in which there were lots of developments taking place in this particular period. But if you ask me, then of course I have to mention the field of metallurgy. In this field, we find that actually, brass is a contribution of the of India, of our country, to the world civilization. And brass, as you know, is an alloy of copper and zinc. Now the use of zinc and probably also the knowledge of copper alloy brass was known to the early historical period Indians, because we find reference in Arthashastra to Orokuto, which is actually brass, and again once more in the Gupta period text of Amarkosh we find the mention of brass as Orokuto or Riti. Now apart from that, we have an archaeological evidence from the Zawar mines of Rajasthan, where signs of old workings in the mines have been found and they were studied, and radiocarbon dating of a particular wood shaft was done, which gives once more an early historical date. So that is quite clear, but then we find that in the early medieval period more and more zinc was being used and copper alloy of brass was more and more evident. And obviously because of the availability of zinc rather than tin in our country, we find that more and more brass was being used rather than bronze. That is one of the developments that we witness. More important than that is actually that the theoretical description, information that we have in one of the early medieval Rasha Shastra texts on the extraction of zinc from calamine. Now, this text is called Rasharatna Samuchayo, which is an early medieval text. It describes two processes of extraction of zinc from calamine, and that is actually where you can talk about the technological aspect meeting the theoretical aspect. Another very important contribution of India to the world of metallurgy is the making of the wood steel. Now, that also actually was a contribution made by the Deccan ironsmiths around 10th, 11th centuries AD. This wood steel was being used for the Damascus swords, which were so famous in the medieval times. It is known from literary evidence of all kinds that actually the steel for these swords was being exported by the Deccan ironsmiths around this time.
Ma'am, it is true that it is disseminating outside, but is it that here that all rationality was lost?
Yes, when you come to that, we find that there is this question that we have to ask ourselves, that if India had had such a rich scientific heritage, especially in technology, in the early medieval times, then there should have been some kind of progress in medieval times too, where in fact there was a lot of progress done in medieval times too. But then the question is, then why would India sit back in this race for being industrialized?
Right.
So it was not among one of the first nations to have been
industrialized.
Exactly. You know, I think one of the biggest factors involved here was the factor of social readiness and the factor of policy making. You know, the policy making conditions in India were not only conditioned by the ruling community, it was also conditioned by the theoreticians in the society. And these theoreticians were basically religious in nature. You know, they either in Vedic Brahmanism or later in Islam, there was a preponderance of religiosity. And there was, especially in Vedic Brahmanism, which became very popular and which had entered into down into the fabric, the body of Indian society, was the caste system and also caste-based occupation system. You know, it limited the growth of scientific knowledge. It also limited the exchange of knowledge between one community of researchers, we can call them researchers, and another community of researchers. And also the factor that what was happening in the workroom of the artisan had got so dissociated from the actual scientists, the theoreticians. You know, that is why the feedback stopped coming from the scientist's end into the technologist's workroom, so that even technology at a particular time stopped being innovative, stopped getting innovative results. So that is why, you know, if you cannot really have a continuous exchange of knowledge, a continuous experimentation. The theoretical sciences were not experimenting their theories in the workroom of the artisan, and the artisan was not enriched by the theory given by the scientists. So this lacuna perhaps is actually the most important factor stalling the development of industrialization in a country with a rich heritage of science like India.